Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is In Your Own Backyard. This event is held by Cornell Undergraduate Research Board, and it was organized by the Outreach Committee. My name is Lizzie. I am one of the co-chairs of the Outreach Committee. And today we will just be talking about research that grad students have done around campus regarding the topics of the environment and sustainability. So welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer. I'm the other co-chair of the Outreach Committee, and we want to give you all a very warm welcome to our event today. Just a heads up that this event will be recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And if you would like to revisit that later for more reference, that would be great. So we have 4 wonderful speakers today who will each introduce themselves in the order that they will be presenting. So go ahead.
Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Wilcox. I am a 6-year PhD candidate in the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. And today I'll be presenting on a work in progress that I have going studying the economics of pollination and production of pollination-dependent crops.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Louis Sears. I'm a 4th-year PhD student at the Charles Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell. My research is focused on groundwater management and sustainable use of natural resources more generally. Before starting at Cornell, I did some research out west in California, and before that, some policy research in Washington, D.C. I'm a native of Ithaca and happy to be back at Cornell. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Shu Young. I'm a PhD candidate also from the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. My current research is focused on energy and environmental policies and food and agriculture economics, especially as they pertain to China. More specifically, I've been working on the effects of food safety and policy events on restaurant food demand, the effects of energy and the environmental related policies on energy consumption, as well as on GDP output and profits in China, and the effects of biofuel policies on agriculture and export markets. Thanks.
Hi everybody, I'm Marley. I'm a 1st-year PhD student in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, and I study environmental economics in the realm of ecological economics, so looking at environmental ethics, environmental justice, and environmental public policy. Specifically, right now I work with avian populations through the Lab of Ornithology and the value of birds to the environment.
Okay, awesome. So we will now be starting with Stephen's presentation. After each presentation, we'll give around 5 to 10 minutes for questions specifically regarding them. And then we'll also have a large Q&A for the end. So I'm going to stop sharing and Stephen can then start his presentation.
Okay. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I've already introduced myself, so I won't repeat that. The title of my presentation today is Optimal Farm Level Pollination Investment for Producers of Pollination-Dependent Crops. And I want to quickly thank the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future for providing our research group with several grants to support our work. And I want to thank my co-authors and collaborators at the Dyson School, the Cornell Department of Entomology, Cornell Cooperative Extension Lake Ontario Fruit Program, and a handful of very helpful undergraduate research assistants. So I don't know how we can probably, so I want to do, if anybody can tell me what object we're looking at here in this picture. Maybe we can use the chat window where people can unmute themselves or something. Anybody have a guess?
Are they bees?
Bees. Oh, that's very good. Somebody nailed it. Yeah. So these are bees. So what we're seeing here in what's called in the business is a pallet of bees. So if you guys go to the grocery store or the hardware store, you see these big wooden pallets, and sometimes you see crates and boxes on top of those. And that's literally what we're seeing right here. So that's a crate of about 6 colonies of honeybees. And if you go around the country for anywhere that produces fruit, vegetables, or nuts that are dependent on insect pollination in the springtime during peak bloom, have enough local produce to pollinate crops, rent that migrate literally around the country in some cases, and following the bloom period around the country to rent their bees to people. And so they come and they'll unload literally pallets of bees with a forklift and then distribute them throughout the farmer's fields to induce pollination in the crops of interest. So we'll do another quiz here. Can anybody tell me what crop we're looking at in this picture?
Are they
Maybe a little
grapes?
harder. Did you say grapes?
Yeah.
That's a good guess and a logical thought, but it's actually not. Believe it or not, everybody, this is a modern apple orchard. This is what's referred to as a high density trellis system. And literally the trees are just squozen in as tightly as can be. They're as close as 2 to 3 feet apart, and just as dense as you can possibly be. So this is not your grandma's apple orchard where you can crawl around in a tree and pick apples. But you can get a sense of when these trees are in bloom, the demand that is needed by farmers and the quantity of insects that are needed to pollinate crops like this. And this is a common production system that you see for apples. This picture is actually taken from upstate New York. New York is the second only to Washington state in apple production in the United States. Yeah, so there you go. So a little bit of background. So in the last 15 to 20 years, interest in all things pollination has really increased dramatically. If you just do a simple Google search, you will just be bombarded by millions of results talking about all sorts of things related to pollination. And some of the catalysts for this interest is really around this phenomenon called colony collapse disorder, which was observed in about observing very high elevated rates of mortality in honeybee colonies. And people have gotten really concerned about this because significant proportions of our food supply do rely on honeybee colonies. And so interest is kind of entomologists and ecologists is showing all sorts of interesting things. But a few highlights that are important to note for our research is that wild pollinators have been found to contribute substantially, not only to the quantity of fruit that is produced, but also to the quality. And the quality is really important because that affects the price that a farmer can receive at the end of the day after producing their crops. There are also well-established reasons for concern regarding the stability of wild pollinator stocks. When I use the word stock, that means basically the population. And there's good evidence that farm-level pollination input choices, so how farmers choose to pollinate their crops, really matters, not just for pollinators themselves, but also for farm-level outcomes. Over this period of time, civil society and private sector have been responding in kind. There's a well-publicized ban on certain pesticides that has taken place in the European Union. There's actually a Senate bill in New York State that is proposing to do similar things. The U.S. Farm Bill has all sorts of resources now for encouraging private landowners to do good things for pollinators. And there's even patents out there now that are being filed for drone-based pollination technology. Economics research has also been increasing substantially, coincident with all these trends, but most of the research is focused on managed pollination services. So that means domesticated bees like honeybees and other types of bees, and focus on beekeepers themselves and prominent sectors like the almond sector in California. The choices that farmers are making and how they pollinate their crops are really important, but they're in fact really poorly understood, and that's where our work comes in. So a few kind of big picture questions for you guys to think about that help motivate why we might want to look at this angle is, what are the basic choices that farmers are making to pollinate their crops? How diverse are they? Do things vary across space and time by a lot? Do farmers of apples vary dramatically in terms of how farmers of tomatoes or strawberries or almonds are pollinating their crops? And to what extent are farmers actually constrained by pollination resource availability? There's a lot of speculation out there and thinking that farmers are actually constrained, but there's other cases that show that this is not the case. And so it's somewhat ambiguous, I think, as to what's really going on. then it would also good to know, do farmers actually care how their crops are pollinated, or should they even care? Then it'd be good to know what pollination strategies might be quote unquote optimal for farmers and also for society. And optimality meaning different things depending on yourselves in the audience today, unless some of you are actually farmers of pollination dependent crops. And then a really important notion is, does what is optimal vary, or is there a difference between what's optimal for farmers versus what is optimal for society? And if there's a disconnect between those two things, then that's maybe a place where public policy can come in to help things out. So it's important to note that existing data to get at these questions is really not sufficient to address these questions in an empirical fashion. And that's a really big problem from a societal perspective for how we might construct policies to deal with these issues. So in our project, we've got a two-phase effort going on here. In the first effort, it's going to be part theoretical and part empirical. Whenever I use the word empirical, that means based on data. So a first effort that we're undertaking is to construct what's considered a dynamic theoretical economic model of a farmer's objective present profit. That is like set of over as they make choices on how to use maybe managed pollinators, so honeybees, whether or not they invest in managed pollinators, whether or not they invest in their traditional capital stocks, such as farm equipment, buildings, and things like that, and how much they invest in labor. To do that, we're using a powerful set of tools referred to as optimal control theory. Anybody that's in an engineering field or economics might be familiar with this. We're also studying an untapped set of data on US apple farmers across the country. And we're going to be studying spatial variation in pollination strategies and operating costs. And then we're also doing some simulation modeling using what's referred to as a numeric dynamic program model. That's a pretty fancy term there, to simulate what optimal behavior would be given different states in the world. And a simple way to understand that is, if you're a farmer, even if you're not a farmer, if you're a business owner of any kind, at the start of a year, for example, you have a certain set of things that are already kind of baked in the cake, so to speak. You know maybe what prices are for whatever you're producing, you know what costs are for your inputs, and you have maybe another set of constraints that are known to you. And you have to react to those. There's any number of strategies that you could take to react. Those strategies are going to be equally optimal in terms of how they would generate profits for you. And so that's what this model does. It actually churns through all the different scenarios that a farmer might face and selects out what the optimal set of strategies would be for maximizing profits. So the combination of these efforts will tell us more about the theoretical conditions that underline optimal pollination strategies, and they'll give a suggestive glimpse of what farmers are actually doing in practice. To give you a sense of what this model, some of the results of this model can kick out for us, I'll show you a graph here of what a large apple farmer might be facing. So this is what a large apple orchard looks like in these high density systems when you're down at the ground level. And so this figure is somewhat complicated, and if it doesn't make any sense to you, that's okay. I'll do my best to explain it. You can ignore this language at the top, but if we boil down the choices of whether or not to invest in managed pollinators, that's what this column is here, wild pollinators, traditional capital stock, and labor, and you just boil down that choice into whether or not you should not invest, which would be 0 on this y-axis, or invest, which would be 1 up at the top here, then anywhere this line corresponds to a 0 means that it's optimal for the farmer not to invest, and if it's up at a 1, then it is optimal to invest. So this is based on a 10-year simulation scenario where we assume that the farmer starts out with the state of the world in which all their stocks of pollinators and capital stock are at 0, and they're just starting from scratch. And we also assume in here that wild pollinators are 3 times as expensive as managed pollinators, and that they are 3 times as effective as managed pollinators. And these assumptions actually have good empirical basis. Work from Cornell Department of Entomology has shown that wild pollinators are as much as 4 times as effective as managed pollinators in So under this scenario, we see that it is always optimal over a 10-year time horizon to invest in wild pollinators, and that it eventually becomes optimal to invest in managed pollinators. I won't focus so much on the capital stock and the labor for now, and we'll just focus on the pollination choices. For a small farmer though, and this kind of gives you a sense of what some of the small orchards out there look like. You can see the base of these trees are really large. The trees are really spaced out. These trees don't look very big because the branches have been clipped back and somebody's been going in and rejuvenating probably what's been an old orchard. But with the same setup, we can see a big contrast here in that this model shows that it's never optimal for a small farmer to invest in managed pollinators, but generally always optimal to invest in wild pollinators, although only to the extent that it's necessary. So this bottom row, I didn't explain this before, but this top row shows how the movement in choices for how to invest in a given input vary over time. But this bottom row shows the corresponding movement in the stock variable itself. So this captures the movement in the stock of managed pollinators. This captures the movement in wild pollinators, and this captures the movement in the size of the capital stock itself. So that covers some of the things that we're doing in phase one. So in phase two, we're going to be actually collecting new data from apple farmers in New York State. And what we're going to be doing as a part of this project is capturing enough data to characterize farm level pollination supply and demand. So getting a sense of the relative share and contributions from managed and wild pollinators, the extent to which farmers are over or undersupplied with pollinators. We'll also be able to test for various effects of farm characteristics on farm pollination choices. So does the size of the farm matter? Does what's happening on your neighbor's land matter? And then we'll also be able to construct a model similar to the one I've just been explaining before this, dynamic programming model that's empirically based, actually based on the data that we get from farmers, so it'll be much more realistic. And so in this project, we'll be able to more about what farmers are actually doing, New York apple farmers in particular. This will tell us something about how sensitive farmers are to changes in pollination service fees. It'll allow us to empirically determine what optimal pollination strategies are for farmers. And we'll be able to do things like counterfactual experiments in which we envision maybe a different state of the world in which prices are different, or maybe a policy is in place to help farmers conserve pollinators. And then we can see how the optimal strategies change. So that in a nutshell is what my work is all about. And if anybody has any short questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We'll be taking a couple questions right now. So if you have any questions, just type them out in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have.
I did get sent a question that I will ask. Do you have the opportunity to interact with farmers around New York and discuss with them just about your research in general?
Yes, I've had the opportunity to interact with a lot of farmers, and it's really interesting. So one of the things I didn't mention about, I could have gone into more detail about, but there's a bit of a conundrum. I mentioned earlier about the relative effectiveness of. Can you hear me?
You started cutting out a little bit.
Did I go in and out there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm getting a signal that my connection is unstable too. But so just quickly, so there's good research that shows that wild pollinators are more effective than managed pollinators. So that suggests that farmers should be preferentially favoring investments in these resources over just doing whatever they do normally in terms of spray schedules and so forth, or for pesticides and herbicides, and whether or not they rent honeybees or not. The reality seems to be this isn't the case for all farmers, but a lot of farmers in New York State, some that I've interacted with, pollinators are actually an afterthought for them. They view renting honeybees as kind of cheap insurance, and it's not something that they worry a lot about. That's not the case for all farmers out there. I've actually talked to some farmers who At one point in the past, they had a really difficult time actually finding bees to rent, and they forwent that option in that year, and they discovered that their production was actually fine. And they have been relying 100% on wild pollinators for about 10 years now, and do things on their farm to conserve pollinators on their place. So yeah, long story short, yes, I have been interacting with them and continue to do so in my work. It's a good question.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Does anyone have any other questions? If not, we can move on to our next presenter, Lewis. And yeah, if you think of any more questions, then we will have time at the end to ask them. So Lewis, you are free to share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. That was super interesting. So my name's Lewis, and like I said, I'm a PhD student at the Dyson School at Cornell. My research is focused on groundwater management in California. When we think about water issues, we typically think about, the pollution in rivers or lakes, or maybe, the health of our oceans. But for a lot of arid regions, like California, where surface water supplies like rivers and lakes are more rare, groundwater plays a really important role. So when we think about groundwater, it's useful to have kind of a visual in mind. So below the ground, as you can see in this figure, we have aquifers, or flowing water that goes over space. And they can be separated by confining beds of bedrock into confined aquifers or free-flowing unconfined aquifers. They can interconnect with streams in the area. And when it rains, some of the precipitation will infiltrate the ground and help to recharge the groundwater. And when we pump groundwater from the ground, it removes this water from the aquifer, and people can use it, for crops or even to drink. So when we pump groundwater, it creates what's called a cone of depression. And the way to think about this, as you can see in the picture, is that the water table starts to depress, or starts to sink lower into the ground in the area around the well when we pump. So when we pump groundwater, the elevation of the water table or the aquifer around the well becomes lower. And this has an important effect on the groundwater system in the area. So in this picture, we can show what happens in the groundwater system when one person pumps groundwater from a well, and there are other wells nearby. So first, we're going to look at what happens when no one's pumping water. So if there's some rainfall on the ground surface, it starts to infiltrate the ground, like I mentioned before, and it flows through the aquifer, and eventually might empty out into the nearby stream. So now let's look at what happens when we have some groundwater pumping. So we'll imagine that there's pumping at this deeper well, but not at this nearby shallow well. So when there's pumping at the deeper well, we create this cone of depression, like I mentioned before, where the water table sinks in the area around the deeper well. And what that creates is movement of the groundwater flow in the system towards this cone of depression, towards this deeper well. And so now, instead of flowing straight out to the stream, this water starts flowing towards this cone of depression and away from areas like the shallow well. And what can happen is the water table level around that shallow well will start to sink as well. And so even though water is not being pumped from the shallow well, the water table level is retreating in the area around it. And what that can lead to is the owner of the shallow well, even though they're not pumping any water, not using up the water around them, their access to groundwater can, eventually become more difficult, and they may even lose access to water and may have to drill a deeper well in order to access it. And so this carries important implications in that the owner of the deeper well, when they're making their decision about groundwater extraction, doesn't really take into account the effect on their neighbors when they're making that decision. they may account for how it affects their own costs and their own benefits in the future and in the present, but they don't account for the effect on their neighbors. And this leads to kind of an inefficient use of groundwater over time. So, why is groundwater so important in the West and in California in particular? California's climate, its arid climate, makes it possible to grow a number of really valuable crops, like fruits and nuts and vegetables. Kind of when we think of agriculture in California, we think of giant, fields of almond orchards. But since it's so dry out there, there isn't enough rainfall to keep the crops alive, meaning that they need to be irrigated. And since there aren't big rivers and lakes to feed that irrigation, like I mentioned before, the areas depend on groundwater to supply this water. But in addition to this, there are also large population centers like cities and suburbs that are growing rapidly out into areas that were previously used for agriculture or not used at all, kind of in the desert areas of California, where there's very little surface water, very few streams to supply drinking water. And these areas also need to use groundwater to meet their drinking water needs. The problem is these trends are not going in the right direction. Populations are projected to continue to grow in these areas, meaning that the populations will need even more water for their drinking needs. And at the same time, more of California's agriculture is becoming based around tree crops like almonds. And farmers will have a harder time adjusting their water demand in a drought when water becomes scarce. And so this is called demand hardening. And at the same time, these droughts are projected to become more frequent under a lot of climate change models. So there'll be even more cases where there may not be enough groundwater to meet the state's needs in the future. So we can see kind of what happens during a drought by looking at the most recent drought in California. So during the early to mid 2010s, we saw an extended drought in the state. Much more groundwater was used than was recharged back into the ground. And in this map on the left, the darkest red regions are areas where the level of the water table declined the most during the drought. And as you can see, in the middle part of the state, there are some very dark red regions. And this is the Central Valley of California, which is home to a lot of the state's most valuable agriculture. So there was significant depletion of groundwater stocks in this area. But there were also significant declines along the southern coast, which is the Los Angeles area, which also relies on groundwater to help meet their drinking water needs. And so many of these areas are considered to be critically overdrafted by the state. And the map on the right shows highlighted the basins that the state considers critically overdrafted, meaning that there's much more water going out than coming back in. And in the aftermath of the recent drought, they're required to come up with plans for managing their groundwater use. And this is a really new phenomenon in California, because before the drought, groundwater in most of the state had been left unregulated, meaning that you could take out kind of as much as you want in a given year if you wanted to use it. In economics, we call this an open access environment. So the exception to this open access environment are what are called adjudicated basins. So the map on the left shows in blue the basins that have gone through groundwater adjudications. And in a groundwater adjudication, basically there's a dispute over groundwater rights, and groundwater users go to court, and a judge works with them to impose a set of rules for managing groundwater use in the basin. And so these are kind of the exception to this open access environment. And as you can see, they're kind of heavily concentrated in the southern part of the state, which is just east of Los Angeles, and this is called the Inland Empire area. So why did the Inland Empire have so many adjudications happen? Why are they so heavily concentrated there? The reason is largely because of rapid population growth in the area in an area with limited groundwater resources. So here on the left, I'll show you the population in the region with a bar. And on the right, I'll show in red the basins that had been regulated through groundwater adjudications up to that date. So if we go in the Wayback Machine all the way to 1970, we can see that population is a little over 8 million in the region. and that there are only a couple real adjudications, so very little management in the region. It's primarily right outside of Los Angeles. If we go forward in time, we start to see that there's increasing population growth on the left, and also more and more of these adjudicated basins, more and more management of groundwater, and it's coming further and further away from Los Angeles. And this represents the fact that population growth is spreading out. The suburbs that are further and further from LA are growing really rapidly during this time. And by the time we get, all the way through the 2000s to kind of the period of the last drought in 2015, we see that population on the left is almost doubled. It's close to 16 million. And much of the groundwater resources in the region are under some form of management through adjudication. So the reason this matters is that these trends are happening throughout the state more broadly, although at a slower rate. For example, this is a map of the San Joaquin Valley in California, which is a major agricultural region. And the dark red areas are regions where land use has changed over the last 20 years from agriculture to urban land use. So we'd expect to see similar management systems in the future get imposed in many of these regions as well. And so that brings us to the research question, which I'm going to talk today, which is what is the effect of switching from an open access environment to a system of quantified property rights management through adjudication on the extraction and the welfare of groundwater users? So to answer that question, we look at data from a basin in Southern California, which actually switched from open access to quantified property right limits on groundwater extraction in the early 2000s. It's called the Beaumont Basin. It's in the Inland Empire area, so just east of Los Angeles, kind of straddling Riverside County and San Bernardino County. And the users in the area were a small group of growing suburban cities or towns, as well as a group of farmers and a group of golf courses that all extract groundwater from the same basin. And so in our research, what we do is we model groundwater extraction behavior under this open access environment where there are no limits. And then we kind of simulate forward and say, what if the property rights system had not been imposed? How would groundwater extraction have played out if the system had been left in open access? And we compare that to what we actually observed in the data when the system switched to this property rights system where there are limits on extraction. We find initially that groundwater, unsurprisingly, is a really valuable resource in the region. It created around $47 million each year in economic benefits for cities and municipalities, this group of growing suburbs in the area. But we find that imposing this system of management, at least in the short run, didn't create much in additional economic benefits. In fact, it was less than $1 million a year in additional benefits, and in the scale of things, this is a relatively insignificant benefit. We also find that these cities and municipalities tended to overweight the interests of creating cheap sources of drinking water for their populations, and that this encouraged rapid development, potentially kind of socially inefficient development in the region. We do find that this property rights system had a major effect on the pattern of groundwater extraction in the region. So this chart shows in black the actual groundwater extraction in the Beaumont Basin, while in blue we have what would have happened if the system had remained under this open access environment. And we find, kind of surprisingly, that if the system had not been imposed, that groundwater extraction would have eventually, been abandoned in the Beaumont Basin. And this is because depth to groundwater, or the level of that water table, would have sunk so far down that it would have become economically inefficient to extract. And what would have happened as a result of that would be that these cities and municipalities in need of water would have had to tap additional sources of groundwater in other areas just outside this region. And this in turn would have driven depth to groundwater in these neighboring basins up. And so this kind of represents, if the system in Beaumont had remained in open access, the water table would have shrunk in other nearby basins as a result. And so this is a really important kind of regional finding and kind of a justification for using some of these property rights systems. Even if they don't create large economic benefits, they may have important sustainability impacts in the region. So moving forward, we're looking at ways to better understand kind of the long run social costs of having these groundwater systems in open access, and also what are the primary sources of inefficiency under open access. We're also looking at modeling the effects of things like climate change that shift the type of weather we expect to see in these regions and how that would impact groundwater usage. And we're finally looking at ways to design better policies for managing groundwater use that create larger economic benefits for the groundwater users and thus encourage them to kind of abandon open access and move toward more sustainable systems of groundwater management. And so thanks very much, and I really look forward to any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thank you, Louis. Yeah, so we'll open the floor to a mini Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or you can also type them in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you for an awesome talk, Louis. I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you think this might be impacting like today's like wildfire tragedy that's going on in California? Like, how might this play into that?
Sure, that's a super interesting question and one that I am trying to get a better handle on. So I don't have a great intuition for how it would impact today's wildfire situation. I've looked at how wildfires impact groundwater usage in the past, and there is some evidence that it causes kind of these spikes in the need for groundwater. And you can imagine that going forward in the future, that it could also create, if we have more and more fires like we're seeing right now, that there could be even more demand for groundwater. And also, there's just these population centers are growing out into areas with scarcer and scarcer sources of water. And so that could also create pressure for additional groundwater. And if we run out of supplies, this could be a big issue in terms of containing some of these fires moving forward. So it's another potential source of problems that could be very realistic given our understanding of some of the problems that might arise under climate change.
Gotcha, thank you.
I have another question that was actually sent to me. So do you know of any ways people can maybe find loopholes in the areas that you're talking about, maybe for like groundwater, like accessibility?
Yeah, so that's an awesome question as well. Actually, we kind of modeled that explicitly in this paper. So in this adjudication, only one basin in the region was regulated. So there were only limits on extraction in that basin. Many of the cities and towns have wells both in that basin and outside of that basin in other nearby areas that they can draw water from. And just looking at some, water district meeting minutes, like notes from their meetings, there's very good anecdotal evidence that this is exactly what they do when they're running low on their annual limit on extraction. They pump up extraction outside the regulated area. And so this is kind of a phenomenon that's known as leakage in environmental economics, where you regulate one area but not the full system, and it causes a leakage of the bad behavior to areas outside the regulation. And that's definitely an issue with groundwater.
Great. Yeah, we have another question in the chat actually. So how easy is it to translate database science such as yours into actual policy change?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I'll know a lot more about that in the coming years as we try to translate it. I think the best thing to have in mind is to actually read what policymakers are thinking about. Look at the meetings they have. I know I went to when I was in California studying, I went to a agricultural expo event where there were meetings with farmers and water district managers in Southern California, and they were discussing kind of these regulations that were imposed at the end of the drought. And so from that, I kind of knew what were the policy relevant questions that they were trying to answer, and that helped to kind of inform what I looked at for my research.
That's great. If anyone else has any other questions, I can take them as well. I received one more, and it's asking, how are the aquifers replenished to keep supplying water to the groundwater well? And maybe how are they affected by like climate change, for example?
Sure. So that's, yeah, in like, you know, the traditional sense, we think of it just being rainfall or like water from nearby streams that infiltrates the water table. But California is actually a technologically really innovative area for this, in that they actually have a system of aqueducts that take water from the northern part of the state where it's more plentiful and ship it or send it all the way down to the southern part of the state. And some of that water is actually kind of injected back into the groundwater aquifer through what are called recharge, managed artificial recharge stations. And so they kind of take outside water and use it to kind of infiltrate the aquifer and recharge it. Once that water gets into the aquifer, though, it's not like you can really, you know, contain it and keep it in one place. So it's not analogous to putting money in the bank or anything. That water can then flow anywhere. So it's a tricky system in terms of incentivizing that kind of behavior. And the other problem is that that water, while it might be plentiful in one year, is not guaranteed to be plentiful in another year. It's really dependent on the snowpack level in the northern part of the state. And that varies year to year. And under, you know, climate change scenarios, it's kind of projected to decrease. And so you can't sustainably rely on having that going indefinitely into the future. So it's a really technologically innovative process, but it's not like a full solution to the problem.
That's great. Thank you so much, Louis.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, we're gonna head on to the next presenter, which is gonna be Shuyang. So feel free to share your screen. We can get started.
Sure. Okay, is the screen showing up all right?
Yes.
Okay, great, yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizing team for organizing this event on innovative perspectives on the environment and for giving me the opportunity to present. And thank you to all of you for joining this Zoom talk. I'm very honored to be presenting at the Cornell Undergraduate Research Board event. My name is Shuyang Su. I'm a PhD student in the Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. Today, I'm going to talk about the effects of environmental policies in China on GDP, output, and profits. My co-authors are Mingjie Lu from Shanghai Lishi University of Commerce, Professor Sinsalin Lowell from Cornell University, and Professor Song Chen from Tongji University. The effects of environmental policies on GDP, output, and profit is the subject of much debate. The conventional wisdom is that environmental regulations have a negative effect on the productivity of firms. Others have challenged this conventional wisdom, asserting instead that environmental policies may stimulate growth and competitiveness. The line of this argument is often called the Porter hypothesis, as it was articulated by Harvard Business School Professor Michael Porter in a Scientific American article he wrote in 1991. There are several levels on which the Porter hypothesis can be interpreted. First, the environmental service sector will benefit directly from environmental regulations on their customers, because these customers will then buy their products. Second, environmental policies can induce innovations in technology to achieve compliance. Third, the Porter hypothesis can be taken to mean that some regulated firms with lower compliance costs might benefit competitively under stricter environmental policies at the expense of other regulated firms. Fourth, environmental policies may induce firms to reconsider their production process and hence to discover innovative approaches not only to reduce pollution, but also to decrease costs or increase output. Fifth, Environmental regulations cause more productive firms to displace less productive ones, leading to increased productivity at the industry level. The effects of environmental policies on productivity, GDP, output, and profits is in part an empirical question and may vary by firm, industry, sector, and type of policy. In this research, we empirically examine the effects of environmental policies in China on GDP, industrial output, and new energy sector profits. This paper builds upon the existing literature by examining the effects of environmental policies in China on GDP, industrial output, and new energy sector profits using province-level panel data over the period 2002 to 2013. As a quick preview, the main findings of this paper are as following. We find that policies involving financial incentives or monetary awards have the potential of increasing the output and or profits in some energy-related industries or sectors, but potentially at the cost of GDP in non-energy industries or sectors. We also find that command and control policies and non-monetary awards appear to decrease GDP, output, and or profits. Having finished my introduction, the rest of the talk proceeds as follows. Next, I will talk about GDP, output, and profits in China. Then I will talk about the data we collected on energy-related policies, our econometric model, and the results, followed by some concluding remarks. This figure shows the national GDP of the primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector in China over the period 2002 to 2013. The primary sector consists of the agriculture, forestry, animal husbandry, and fishery industries. The secondary sector consists of the mining and quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, water and gas, and construction industries. The tertiary sector consists of all other economic activities not included in the primary or secondary sectors, including transport and other services. The energy industry belongs to the secondary sector, which has the highest GDP among the three sectors. And except in 2010, the GDP in the secondary sector has been increasing over time. This figure shows the national industrial output value of traditional energy industries over the period 2002 to 2013. The industries we focus on are the coal mining, smelting, and dressing industry, the petroleum and nuclear fuel processing industry, and the oil and gas exploration industry. As seen in this figure, the industrial output value of each of the traditional energy industries, except for the oil and gas exploration industry, has generally increased over time. We also collect data on the profits of firms in the new energy sector over the period 2002 to 2013 from Hexun.com. Hexun.com is a specialized business and finance information news provider focusing on mainland China financial market. There are a total of 280 firms in the new energy sector in our data set. There are 5 categories of new energy sector industries suggested by Hexun.com. The combustible ice industry, the solar energy industry, the shale gas industry, the nuclear electricity and nuclear power industry, and low carbon economy industry. Some firms are involved in multiple industries in the new energy sector. While most of the industries listed in the new energy sector are intuitive, there are 2 specific new energy industries we find worth explaining more. First is the combustible ice industry. Combustible ice is a frozen mixture of water and concentrated natural gas, which can be lit on fire in its frozen state and is believed to comprise one of the world's most abundant fossil fuels. The other new energy industry worth explaining more is the low carbon economy industry. A firm is listed in the low carbon economy industry if it satisfies the definition of low carbon economy used by the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. The low carbon economy industries includes firms involved in hydroelectric power, wind energy, and energy conservation. This figure plots the profits of all firms in each industries of new energy sector. The solar energy industry has the highest profit. Now I'll talk about the environmental policies in our research. For our environmental policy variables, we collected and constructed a novel and comprehensive data set on environmental policies at the provincial level in China by collecting data from online databases of laws and regulations from the websites of each of the provincial governments, as well as from LawTime. LawTime is a website which collects laws and regulations in China. Our policy variables are constructed from the 2,656 province-level environmental laws and regulations that are in place for at least 1 year over the period 2002 to 2013. These province-level laws and regulations include national laws and regulations implemented in each province, some of which may be differentiated by province. Some of the laws were implemented during the 2002 to 2013 time period of our dataset. Others were already in place. Some laws continued even after the end of our 2002 to 2013 time period. Others expired before the end of the time period. Each of the 2,656 province-level laws and regulations has multiple clauses and may include multiple provisions. For this study, we focus our analysis on the following policy variables. For command and control policy, we have renewable electricity mandates. For financial incentives, we have loans to firms for increasing renewable energy consumption. We also have monetary awards for having reduced pollution and non-monetary awards for having reduced pollution. These 4 policy variables will be the ones we focus on in this study. Now I'll present our econometric model. Here's our model setup. We regress GDP output or profit of type J for province I in year T on environmental policy variable and controls. We estimate an instrumental variables fixed defect model in which we use instruments to address any potential endogeneity of the policies. Now I will present our results. Okay, we first present the results of the IV fixed effects regression of province-level GDP and the province-level GDP in the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. According to the results, renewable electricity mandates, which is a command and control policy, significantly decreases GDP by 0.22%, while monetary awards for having reduced pollution significantly decreases GDP by 0.23%. We also find that providing loans to firms for increasing renewable energy consumption significantly decreases GDP of the primary sector by 0.12%, while providing non-monetary awards for having reduced pollution significantly decreases the GDP of the primary sector by 0.27%. Regarding the GDP of the secondary sector, we find that renewable electricity mandates decreases the GDP of the secondary sector by 0.71%. This table presents the results of the IV fixed effects regression for the industrial output value for the following traditional energy industries: the coal mining, smelting, and dressing industry, the petroleum and nuclear fuel processing industry, and the oil and gas exploration industry. We find that renewable electricity mandates significantly decreases the industrial output value for the petroleum and nuclear fuel processing industry by 8.1%, while providing loans to firms for increasing renewable energy consumption significantly increases the industrial output value for the petroleum and nuclear fuel processing industry by 0.27%. In the next 2 slides, we present the IV fixed effects results for the total profits of firms in the new energy sector, which includes the combustible ice industry, the solar energy industry, the shale gas industry, the nuclear electricity and nuclear power industry, and the low carbon economy industry. We find that providing monetary awards for having reduced pollution significantly increases the total profit of firms in the new energy sector by 3.36%. In contrast, providing non-monetary awards for having reduced pollution significantly decreases the total profit of firms in the new energy sector by 3.25%, and the total profit of firms in the low carbon economy industry by 4.69%. In the next 2 slides, we present the IV fixed effects for the net IV fixed effects results for net profit of firms in the new energy sector. We find that renewable electricity mandates significantly decreases the net profit of firms in the combustible ice industry in the new energy sector by 5.14%, while providing non-monetary awards for having reduced pollution decreases the net profit of firms in the low carbon economy industry in the new energy sector by 4.32%. While providing monetary awards for having reduced pollution significantly increases the net profit of firms in the nuclear industry in the new energy sector by 6.57%. Now some concluding remarks. Critics of environmental policies often claim that such policies decreases productivity and profits. The effects of environmental policies on productivity, GDP output, and profits is in part an empirical question. However, it may vary by firm, industry, sector, and type of policy. This paper examines the effects of environmental policies in China on GDP, industrial output, and new energy sector profits using province-level data over the period 2002 to 2013. Consistent with the Porter hypothesis, we find that loans to firms for increasing renewable energy consumption have a significant positive effect on the industrial output value of the petroleum and nuclear fuel processing industry, and monetary awards for having reduced pollution have significant positive effects on total profits of firms in the new energy sector and on net profits of firms in the nuclear power industry in the new energy sector. These policies have significant negative effects on the GDP of the primary sector and total GDP, however. In contrast, other policies, including the renewable electricity mandates through command and control and non-monetary awards for having reduced pollution, have negative effects on GDP output and or profits. Our results suggest that policies involving financial incentives or monetary awards have the potential of increasing the output and or profits in some energy-related industries or sectors, but potentially at the cost of total GDP and GDP in the primary sector, which consists of the agriculture, forestry, animal husbandry, and fishery industries. In contrast, command and control policies and non-monetary awards appear to decrease GDP output and or profits. In related research that was published in Energy Economics and featured in Cornell Chronicle and Cornell Daily Sun, we examined the effects of different types of energy and environmental related policies on different types of energy consumptions in China. According to our results, some types of energy and environmental related policies have been effective in reducing energy consumption. Many other policies have the possibly unintended or even perverse consequences of increasing rather than decreasing energy consumption, however. Our results on the mixed effectiveness of energy and environment related policies in China in reducing energy consumption have important implications for the design of energy related policies in China and elsewhere. Thank you to everyone for coming to this Zoom talk. I look forward for any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you, Shriyang. So we'll open the floor to any questions. Again, type them in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask in person as well. So we have a question that I received through chat. What do you see as the focus of the future for environmental policies being implemented both in China and also globally?
That's a great question. So based on my research, I think one single policy would never do the work. So if we really want to fix the environmental problems or pollution problems in either in China or elsewhere, so having a set of policies is very important. So for example, in my research that was published in Energy Economics, which examines the effects of different types of energy and environmental related policies on different types of energy consumptions in China, we find that if we provide subsidy for energy efficient household appliances, then the energy consumption would actually go up, which is what we call the rebound effect. But if we combine this policy with another one, which is providing education for energy conservation, then the effects will be effectively reducing energy consumption. So I think in the future, the environmental and energy related policies should be designed wisely and should be designed in as a set of policies, not just a single standalone policy.
We'll take another question if anyone has any. I have another one in the chat that was sent to me. So has this type of analysis that you're talking about been reproduced in surrounding countries, and how does that compare?
I'm not sure if similar studies have been, I'm not aware of other studies in other countries, but I'll definitely search for any researches related to my study. Yeah, but our findings here are should be applicable to other countries as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Jen, but we another question was sent to me. It's this person asks, what kind of non-monetary rewards were used to incentivize companies to reduce pollution?
I mean, in China, there can be like there can be an event that give you a people will how should I put this? Let me think. So for example, like a public exposure saying that you are doing really well in reducing pollution. Say maybe they will write an article about you or post your achievement on the websites and newspapers, things like that, or even a award, like official award, but without any money related to it, right?
Let's see. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, we have one. Alan asks, on first listening, the data seems complex. It seems that transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is necessary and inevitable. Does your data suggest the best path get there? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I agree that transition from the fossil fuels to renewable energy is necessary and inevitable in the near future. However, my current research doesn't answer that question. Doesn't answer the best path to get there. Yeah, yeah. This is a really good point. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you, Shuyang, for your excellent presentation and also answering all those questions. We'll move on to our last but not least. Our next presenter is Marley. So feel free to share your screen and start whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, thank you everybody for being here today. It's a pleasure to be here and present to you. And thank you for hosting this curve. I'm really excited. My name is Marley, as they've said. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Natural Resources, and I'm a huge nature nerd. And my current research looks at the economic value of birds, at the moment specifically at bird watching. And the reason I got into this research is that I'm really worried about climate change. I originally planned on going to culinary school and opening an off-the-grid Airbnb with a homestead farm in the woods somewhere. And then the world was on fire and I was like, I kind of want to help destroy corporations. So here we are. And so if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask. But right now I conduct a series of meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis basically takes all existing research on a topic and synthesizes it into one model. And so we're looking at the economic values of bird watching, and I'll get into why birds in a couple of minutes. But it's really exciting. I get to look at all of the research that exists and fine tune it down until we've got one result or one model that can be used to apply results to a variety of areas. And that's known as benefit transfer. So we take research done in one area and figure out how it could be applied to a different area. And a reason that I find that these meta-analyses are really awesome is that they often get cited in public policy decisions. So when they're looking to define waters of the US, like new regulations or air pollution policies, what they look to is a meta-analysis to find all of the available lit reviews and the synthesized models to come up with a value. So I'm really excited because hopefully people are gonna use this and make good changes. But to start off, I'd like to ask you a question about birds. So I'd like you to think of what comes to mind when you think of birds. And if you'd like to get interactive with it, you can change your name. If you find the blue box with 3 white dots in it and click there, the fourth option down should be to rename yourself. And so I might say, I think of the canary in the coal mine. But maybe you think of a stereotype about birds or your favorite bird or something like that. So you're welcome to change your name and then scroll through and look at everybody's names, because everybody thinks about birds at some point, whether you know it or not. And then the other thing, and feel free to answer this in the chat, is I'm wondering how many billions of US dollars you think are spent on bird-related activities in the United States every year. I was like floored the first time I found out that it was even in the billions. I was like, I don't know, people buy bird seed? Does that even get into the billions? So if you want to take a guess, I'll give everybody a couple of seconds before I spill the beans.
Is it 7?
It's a little higher than that. It's actually just over $9 billion, which I think is pretty crazy. And so that's on all bird related activities. So people who go and hunt waterfowl, people who are going bird watching, it's pretty popular to go like down to the Florida Keys or to some big like shorebird migration sites. But it amounts to over $9 billion. And so I work with a team at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and we use a variety of data from eBird data, which is something you can do if you go bird watching. You download the eBird app and you log what birds you see, and someone double checks it. So I'm always like, I don't know, I'm not a great bird watcher. What if I'm wrong? Well, someone corrects you if you're wrong. So it gets monitored. And then they also have an app called Merlin, which helps you ID different birds that you see. And we collect data from who's looking up birds. And then we also use radar data, which is really exciting. So we can see how many birds are migrating over a particular area. And the reason that we're partnered with them is that we're trying to merge ecology and the economy, because we can't really have a holistic economy if we're leaving ecology out of the equation. And so we jokingly call ourselves the bird economists, but I've decided it's our new serious title. And so one of the questions that I'd like you to think about during this is, what is your environmental ethic? My environmental research sits at the crux of valuing birds in the environment. The reason I'm okay with doing this is that by placing a monetary value on them, I'm able to prescribe public policy, which makes actual change in our climate change research. However, I personally think that nature holds intrinsic value, and we shouldn't have to put a monetary figure on it. But if I want to make change, and change is often motivated by money, how do I do that if I just say, well, it's worth so much, we can never quantify it? But that's just how I personally came to my research, but it's something I encourage you to think about as you're moving forwards. One of the reasons we decided to use birds is that birds are known as an indicator species, which means that they tell you a lot about the environment. They're at a high trophic level, which means they sit up pretty high in their food chain. And so when I think of birds, I think of the canary in the coal mine. And coal miners used to bring canaries down to the coal mines. And if the canary dropped dead, talk about not valuing birds very much, you knew there were high levels of carbon monoxide and the miners had to get out of the mine because that could cause an explosion and the miners could die. But there are a bunch of other things that birds can tell us too. I'm sure you've heard lately in the news about harmful algal blooms, which is like toxic algae in your swimming areas. If you're in the Finger Lakes, we get it in Cayuga all the time. And birds can actually show us those before technology reports results, because harmful algal blooms make birds act drunk. And so birds might eat fish that have eaten these harmful algal blooms, but the fish die. But the birds are able to make their way back to land, and then they wobble around like someone who stayed at the bars too late, and people find them and are like, what is wrong with this bird that's foaming at the mouth? And then we find that they're exhibiting algal toxicity from the cyanobacteria. And so I just think it's so cool how much they can tell us. They're also really good indicators of air pollution because of the way that their lungs work. And so we can use them to say like, hey, birds are worth over 9 billion in the economy. Our current measures of air pollution are killing them left and right. So let's bring in some new air pollution policies to help make sure we kill fewer birds and still have $9 billion in the economy. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but I get excited and start rambling. So the reason that we're working on this is because we've lost so much biodiversity. Oftentimes you think about extinction, right? Like we no longer have the carrier pigeon. It's never coming back. That sucks. However, we have lost over 3 billion birds. That's 29% of bird abundance since 1970. And that's what this A graph is showing. Since 1970 until just past 2010, we've lost 3 billion birds. That's a lot of birds. Like, that's not normal. That's not natural. That's not just like them dying of natural causes. That's because they are eating toxins from our environment and their eggs are no longer viable to hatch. They're too thin, they crack, the baby birds die. If a mama bird gets killed and can't get back to feed the baby birds, then every baby bird in that nest dies. I mean, we've got a huge bird problem right now. And bird watching is really fun. I don't know if you've watched birds during the pandemic, but they're super cute. We've got a couple blue jays. Did you know cardinals mate for life? Like, that's just adorable. Your next Hallmark movie is going to be about a cardinal couple. And so we know all about these birds and how many that we've lost, and we know that they're worth so much in the economy, and so we're trying to use them to motivate policymakers. So at the moment, we're looking at bird watching. We're also at the beginning of conducting a meta-analysis on hunting, pollination via birds, pest control, seed dispersal, and nutrient cycling. Most of what we know currently is bird watching and bird hunting, and that's because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducts a survey every 5 to 10 years, which values those. So those values are already in our literature reviews, but people are starting to understand more the economic value of nutrient cycling from birds and things like that. But already we have 47 million people spending $9.3 billion per year. That's almost $200 per person. And that's like what else do you spend $200 per year on? That's just like an activity, unless it's like skiing, your rent, like $200 is a lot of money, especially given that most people only spend 5 to 13 days doing these bird activities. So it's a pretty hefty sum every day. So we looked at the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to decide how we were going to look at these values, because there's 4 different types of ecosystem services. The first is provisioning, which is what these birds give us. So hunting, it puts a duck on your table. I guess a turkey would have been a better example. Happy Thanksgiving. But it puts a bird on your table. Then there's regulating services, which helps regulate environmental processes. So these are things like pest control or seed dispersal. There's also cultural benefits, which are often the ones that we have a really hard time valuing in the economy because they're immaterial to us. It's the spiritual significance, the educational opportunities, and the recreation of bird watching. There's also supporting services that help ecosystems function, and this is their role as an indicator species, telling us what's going on in lower taxes or helping cycle nutrients. And so what we found through our bird watching study is that at a minimum, people would pay 29 cents more per person per day to go bird watching. At a maximum, they would pay $824 more to go bird watching. So what we're measuring is the willingness to pay above and beyond what they currently pay. So say you go bird watching at your favorite park every year, and there's a $20 entrance fee. So you pay that $20 fee. That's how much you actually spend. If prices increased $30 per day and you would still go, that's how much you would be willing to pay above and beyond what you actually pay right now. So we call that $10 difference, the difference between the $20 you're paying now and the $30 you would pay if you had to, your net benefit. And so that's how much money is unrealized in our economy. So we've got billions of people going bird watching, and they're already paying some amount to do so. But if we increased prices, what is the maximum price people would pay before they'd stop going bird watching? And that's what we're interested in, because if we upped these prices, that additional money, that $10 per person to go to your park to go bird watching, could be used to help for air pollution control policies or cleaning up our lakes to get rid of cyanobacteria. There's a variety of different applications, one of which in the news just a couple of weeks ago was all of the migratory birds that were found dead in New Mexico. Now, there's a lot of speculation. Was this because of wildfires? Was it that they got smoke in their lungs from the wildfires? Was it that they were trying to escape the wildfires and so they migrated 2 months too early and they didn't weigh enough? Imagine if you had to fly hundreds of thousands of miles, how many calories you would need stocked up. Like, I need an extra bowl of pasta if I add another mile to my run. So imagine you're trying to fly from Canada to Mexico. That's a lot of bowls of pasta for a bird. And if you had to leave early and you couldn't eat enough pasta, you'd probably die. Don't feed birds pasta. They don't eat pasta. They shouldn't eat pasta. But The point is, our environment, especially anthropogenic climate change, is affecting how many birds are alive. And I think the birds themselves matter. However, there's also this addition of all of these birds dying, that's got to affect people too. Like, what are the effects on people's lungs of these wildfires? And so if we extrapolate that and use this economic value of birds, we can figure out how much money we have to give to this climate change policy. And that's where I think this really exciting intersection sits. So that's why I'm really pumped about my research. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm only in the first year of my PhD, so I've got a lot more work to do, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions now, or I left my email there if you have any questions. Also, side plug, if you happen to be a woman in STEM and you have any questions about being a woman in STEM, I'm also always happy to talk about that. I get that it can be a little bit of a different environment. So thanks for coming to listen.
Thank you so much, Marley. That was a really fun and adorable presentation. We all loved it. So we'll be taking any questions you have specific for Marley. So type in the chat or unmute yourself and ask as well. All right, I have a question. It's like related to Cornell a little bit, but I heard that there was a bird watching class at Cornell, at like the Cornell Ornithology Lab. Are you involved, or like, can you recommend any classes from there?
So there is a bird watching class. There's also a bird tagging lab class, which is really cool for undergraduate students. There's also learning to draw anatomically correct pictures of birds. There's the Lab of Ornithology offers so many amazing classes. I am not involved in the bird watching class. I'm just involved in my weekend bird watching activities by myself. However, I do sit in on a seminar once a week, which I find super exciting. They let anyone come and they keep the recording. So every Tuesday, I believe it's 5:15 to 6:15, a different member of the Lab of Ornithology presents on the current state of their research. And it's such an awesome way to learn more about birds. And it's run by Irby Levette. And if anybody has any interest and you would like to email me or email him, he'd be happy to get you in. We all just like sit around and talk about birds for an hour. And it's pretty exciting. Also, if you're in Ithaca and you haven't visited the Sapsucker Woods yet, which is where the Lab of Ornithology is located, you can walk around and see all of their bird cameras. So you can watch their bird cams online, but you can also see where they are in the Sapsucker Woods if you go for a walk through the woods. You just aren't allowed to bring your dogs there because it disrupts. Dogs like to chase birds, so they don't want you to disrupt the experiments.
That's great. I've actually been there before and it's really, really nice. So I highly recommend as well. Yeah, so we have another question in the chat. If you're synthesizing data, where is that data specifically coming from, or how do you plan to get it?
Yeah, so that's a phenomenal question. And if I highly recommend taking classes on doing like literature reviews and literature searches, especially like Man Library offers a bunch of them. But essentially what I do is we're trying to get both published literature and what's called the gray literature. And the gray literature is lit that didn't get published in a journal. And that's actually a lot harder to collect. And so finding published literature is pretty easy. I do keyword searches in like Google Scholar and Exodus and like all of our different websites. But then it's also, this is where networking comes into play, both my advisor and connections that I've made in the field of ornithology and environmental economics and connections that she's developed. We kind of spam email all of them and say, hey, we're doing this meta-analysis. We're looking for literature about this. And do you have any that I might not find that's been published? Additionally, I'm in contact with the US Fish and Wildlife Survey, and I email them all the time asking if they have any literature that they haven't published that I could use. My research currently is only in the US and in Canada. So I also email, Canada has like a main library that I email. So I send a lot of emails to a lot of people. I highly recommend getting a good formula email to like introduce yourself to people you don't know and not being afraid to send it out to everyone, because otherwise I'd be missing like half of my data set.
That's really cool. Do we have any other questions for Marley? If we don't, we can move on to general Q&A. This general Q&A can also be for a specific person, or it can just be any general questions that anyone has just about like the topic of ideas in environmental environment and sustainability research or related to any presenters' presentations. So yeah, so open the floor. Remember, you can type in the chat or also unmute yourself and ask any questions.
And I am trying to stop sharing my screen. My window just disappeared, so give me 1 second.
No problem.
No worries. Thank you again, Marley, and all the other speakers. We really appreciate it. Okay. I have a question. We actually had sent out an RSVP form, and so we had a few students ask these questions in advance. So one of them was, what's the importance of community gardens on health education and environmental sustainability? And anyone can answer this question.
Okay, so I think I'm from upstate New York, and we have a lot of community gardens here. I also know we have a couple in Ithaca, but I'm fairly new to the area. And one of the things that I find really important, and we see this in a lot of areas, is that it's hard to understand why something matters if you don't have a personal connection with it. And so I find that community gardens are such a great way to get people involved in an open and welcoming way. Plus, who doesn't love the fact that like you get food out of it? We're all motivated by food. And especially getting to grow your own food, like that's such a beautiful process. And to then, I remember when I was little, like if I had grown the tomato, I was like, I grew this tomato and now we're eating it for dinner. And everyone's going to tell me how proud of me they are for my tomato. And I don't think I would be as motivated if I hadn't learned about that so early on.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I'm not really involved in community gardens, but I think a big advantage of them is just if you're new to an area or if you're interested in sustainable agriculture and stuff, you can kind of meet a lot of people in your area who are also interested in that, and you become aware of a lot of more opportunities beyond just the garden. So it has like a really nice, growing effect in terms of building a community and helping you know like relevant stuff in your area.
Those are really great answers. We have another question. So we noticed that there's a lot of communication, a lot of connections between environment, sustainability research, and also economics, business, and government. So how do these interactions play a role in your research, specifically through like science communication?
I mean, I know in my research, it was definitely something I had to build up a lot of background knowledge on. I didn't have any real background in kind of hydrology and stuff related to groundwater. And so involved reading, stuff outside of economics to get interested in that. And then also reading about like a lot of the natural resource economics in my area of interest. So.
I think we talk a lot about the intersectionality of our research in environmental econ and how valuable that is in today's day and age. And one thing that I've found super beneficial is that so I have a mixed background in economics and environmental studies. And there's something really great about taking like a specific environmental economics class. However, there's also so much value in understanding the background theory in econ and the background theory in ecology. And I took all of these classes that I never would have expected myself to take. And it definitely requires a lot of outside research and finding your own individual niche and understanding that you're never going to know everything about either subject. Like you sit at the intersection. And so you know a little bit about a lot of things, and then you pull in the experts from other areas to fill in the gaps of things that you don't know. One of my advisors is a statistical economist, and I'd be so lost without him. And so it's really great to have all of this help.
Great. If you have any other questions, feel free to type in chat or also unmute yourself and speak.
I was just going to ask, what are some of the biggest barriers that you think you find when trying to collect data, and also like the implications of like adding your research and sharing it with the community. Do you find it's difficult in order for you to do that? And yeah, how do you go about that in general?
I think I can talk about how the difficulties in collecting data. I tend to work with large data set. And for example, for this paper, I collected almost about, I scanned through almost about 3,000 different documents, government documents, laws and policies. It took a lot of time to do so. And the newer policies, they are like, they have electronic versions of the documents that you can like use similar techniques like in the web scraping. For the older ones, you have to read through it. But I mean, it's also been beneficial to understand how different provinces in China have been employing different policies to have a very general understanding of how of the entire policies, and as well as how policies are differentiated in different provinces in China as well. Yeah. And regarding sharing my studies, yeah, I think events like this are really good to share so that students are going to be able to share their recent researches to the local or to the public. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, similar to what Shuyang just said, for me, getting data on individual groundwater extraction by like people or farmers is like really difficult in California. There's not very much of it. And that's because there's like a culture of, I mean, being kind of private and protective of your privacy around that issue that exists out there. And that's, you know, a barrier in some ways to kind of implementing what you think would be the optimal policy or something like that. And it, you know, learning about that helped me learn kind of more about different interest groups and their attitudes towards different types of policies. And, you know, it's something to bear in mind when you're, you know, writing out policy prescriptions is kind of like, you know, you need to get a broad base of support from policymakers who represent those interest groups in some cases in order for your policy research to actually be like effective and get used. And so it's, you know, sometimes getting the data helps you realize like A, what people value, and B, kind of what they don't, you know, or yeah, I guess just what they value in terms of policies. So it can really help your research.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, oh, just kidding. Pigeons and Hawks asks, is there any research/programs at Cornell concerning these sustainable behaviors? That's a really great question.
So as far as research goes, I would say looking through professors and subjects that you're interested in, and every professor has a bio on their page. And then what I did is I emailed them all to set up a meeting, and basically was like, hey, can you tell me about your research / do you need a research assistant? Can I like scan through your data? I'm a big fan of talking to people and just like putting yourself in your way. And at one point someone's going to say, yeah, we'd love to have you help. As far as programs go, I mean, I'm in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment, and so pretty much everyone there is working on something sustainability related. But that also has a lot of intersection with a bunch of different programs. I mean, we work with AIM Applied Econ all the time in their environmental and natural resources economics, and ecology and evolutionary biology, a lot of the engineering programs, food science. Pretty much any department is going to have someone focused on something sustainability related. But if you look at the Atkinson Center, which is our Global Climate Change and Sustainability Center, they'll list every professor who's related with sustainability research and then lead you to specifically what kind of research they do. So they're a great resource. I'll type the Atkinson Center in the chat.
Yes, that would be so great. Thank you. Okay, so we're just gonna wrap up the event. A big thank you to Louis, Marley, and Shuyang for presenting, as well as Stephen. He had to leave a couple of minutes early. But yeah, thank you all so much. We know you guys have busy schedules, so we really appreciate that you took time out of your day to present and just share what you're contributing to the Cornell campus and the world. So yeah, thank you so much. I will send out a email with all the presenters' net IDs, or you can just type them in the chat, the presenters right now, if you would like, just so if anyone has any specific questions, they can directly message you. And also, this event is recorded, so be expecting it to be on the Curb's YouTube channel very shortly to revisit or to share with your friends and family. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for the speakers. We really appreciate it, and we really loved having you all. So thank you.